Greetings and welcome back. I would like to spend some time looking at the Love Canal disaster and how it ultimately led to the creation of what's commonly called the Superfund Law by Congress in 1980. A little bit earlier than that, and certainly prior to the creation of the Superfund Law, a lot of the environmental regulations that governed how companies interacted with the environment were at best lax. And in 1942, Niagara Power and Development Company granted Hooker Chemical Company permission to use the basin of the former Love Canal located in upstate New York to dump waste. If you look in the upper right of this slide, you can see that there's an image here that illustrates, of course, many years later, the types of storage containers that the Hooker Chemical Company was putting hazardous materials into, putting them at the bottom of the canal, and then covering them over. The canal was purchased by Hooker Chemical Company, as well as 70-foot wide banks on both sides of the canal, and this became a hazardous toxic landfill. Over the 10 years that the canal was in operation, Hooker Chemical dumped almost 22,000 tons of chemical waste in that landfill. A little bit later, they closed the landfill, they lined it with some clay, and they stopped using it for that purpose. And by the 1950s, the city had taken over the site and started constructing an elementary school on the particular landfill. So beneath the school and its grounds were this hazardous waste dump site. In the late 1950s, the neighborhoods around the area started developing, and it became necessary to add additional infrastructure, things like highways and sewer lines, etc. And in the process of developing the local expressway, the city actually punctured the walls of lining the landfill. And about 20 years later, so a little bit of a delay, there was an extreme winter storm that dumped a significantly larger amount of snow than normally fell in the region. And when all that snow started to melt in the spring, the water table rose high enough to infiltrate into the cracks within the canal's walls. And because the container devices had started to corrode, actually interacted with some of the hazardous materials, and that ultimately spread to the water throughout the water supply for the local region. By a year later or so, the residents of the neighborhood adjacent to the canal had started to report an extreme number of illnesses, largely related to things like cancer and a large number of miscarriages, and people became quite sick, and they shut down the neighborhood. They relocated a lot of the people, and it really drew attention to the need to think about how companies dispose of toxic waste. And so in 1980, the U.S. Congress passed what's called, conveniently, the Superfund Law. Although it has a much longer name, it is officially the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. But again, it's known as the Superfund Law. It's intended to provide a means for agencies to clean up hazardous waste sites and spills, and it designates anything as a hazardous substance if it would be toxic to the body but also corrosive or flammable. So this is not going to cover petroleum. Oil spills do not fall under hazardous waste. The government monitors the release of these chemicals into the environment, and whether that's deliberate or accidental doesn't make any difference. And it can order two different types of cleanup at what's called a Superfund site. Either it can remove the toxic waste material. That's a short-term quick measure designed to stabilize the site and provide imminent protection against imminent hazards. Or it can require remediation, where it's a much longer-term process, but the agency is responsible, or the organization is responsible, for permanently cleaning the site. The government will select the standards necessary for the cleanup when determining if there is a need to enact the provisions of the law. It uses the least expensive remedy to get the job done according to the expected standards. So in other words, it has to be cost effective, and that can get into a lot of trouble because just because something is not cost effective doesn't mean it shouldn't be cleaned up. So a lot of hazardous waste sites don't necessarily become cleaned because they're not cost effective to do so. I have included here a map as of as of October 2013, the location of all the Superfund sites here in the United States. In Arizona, we have 11 Superfund sites on the national priorities list, and this is a list of sites that are like considered to be extremely toxic and extremely hazardous. And these are the sites that receive priority for any cleanup fund should there be I guess a surplus of money is available to help clean up the sites. One of the interesting aspects about the Superfund law that has played out in the courts is that individuals who dump the chemicals are responsible, although it's sometimes challenging to hold them accountable, as you'll see when you watch the video of the interview with the former executive of Hooker Chemical with respect to the Love Canal. But also individuals who take possession of a toxic environment are also liable for the cleanup of that environment. So if a chemical company were to pollute a location, let's say a developer in an industrial section of Phoenix, for example, were to pollute the soils, and then 20 years later, the city acquires the property, now the city is also responsible for the cleanup in addition to the chemical company. And that chemical company may or may not be in business anymore. And so as the properties pass from one entity to another, the liability also passes. And so it's an interesting thing. Here in Phoenix, we have a number of sites that the city has that aren't necessarily Superfund sites, but they're what's called brownfields. And a brownfield is any site that has the appearance or perception of being toxic. And there are a number of brownfield sites in cities all around the country. And it's just a matter of remediating the site to clean it up and make it usable in the eyes of the public. And sometimes the remediation makes certain land uses acceptable, but not others. For example, there was a site in the city of Baltimore that had been industrial for a really long period of time. They did some remediation, they cleaned it up, and they redeveloped it to be a commercial zone. It was not permitted to be residential, but it could be commercial and clean industrial. So sometimes the remediation process does permit additional land uses, but still restricts things like, in particular, residential. So we're not going to talk any more about the Superfund law. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the Superfund law, and I'll see you in class.